In the autumn of 1944, a strange and terrible paradox gripped the Allied war effort in northwest Europe. The great armies of liberation, having surged across France in a summer of spectacular victory, were now grinding to a halt. The advance had outrun its lifeblood. The logistical chain, stretching hundreds of miles back to the beaches of Normandy, was shattered. Every rifle round, every gallon of fuel, every field dressing had to be carried over a tortuous broken road network by the exhausted drivers of the Red Ball Express. Armored divisions, the tip of the Allied spear, sat idle, their steel sinews starved of petroleum. The momentum that had promised an end to the war by Christmas was evaporating, yet the solution was in their hands. On the 4th of September, the British 11th Armored Division had accomplished a miracle. In a stunning 60-mile dash, they had seized the city of Antwerp, and with it, they had captured the grandest prize on the continent, Europe's largest, most advanced deep-water port. Its sprawling docks, its hundreds of cranes, its vast basins and warehouses were taken almost entirely intact, a gift from the Belgian resistance who had prevented the Germans from demolishing it. The port could handle 60,000 tons of supplies per day. More than all the Normandy beaches combined, it was the key, the absolute, undeniable key, to sustaining the final push into the heart of the Reich. But a chilling silence hung over the port's captured waters. Day after day, week after week, the cranes stood motionless. The great basins remained empty. Not a single Allied cargo ship, not one vessel laden with the materiel of war, could reach the docks. The Allies held the port, but the port was useless. They possessed the solution to their impending logistical collapse, yet were utterly powerless to employ it. An invisible 60-mile barrier stood between the Allied fleets and their prize. For between Antwerp and the open sea lay a labyrinth of islands, peninsulas, and treacherous waterways, the Scheldt estuary, and in this labyrinth a cornered and vengeful German army was digging in for a fight to the death. The Allies had won the port, but now they would have to pay for it, yard by bloody yard. The strategic blunder that led to this crisis was born of optimism and of the intoxicating pace of victory. Following the breakout from the Normandy beachhead and the closing of the Falaise pocket, the German army in France had effectively disintegrated. Allied columns raced eastward in a pursuit that bordered on a rout. Paris was liberated on August 25th and Brussels on September 3rd. The taste of triumph was in the air, and with it, a degree of strategic hubris. At the highest levels of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, the central debate was not if they would cross the Rhine, but how and where. Two competing philosophies dominated the discussion. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, favored a broad front strategy. He envisioned a methodical, unified advance by all Allied army groups, clearing enemy forces and securing a wide front before attempting a massive crossing of the Rhine. It was a conservative, logistics-heavy approach, designed to minimize risk and bring the full weight of Allied industrial might to bear. In stark opposition was the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group. Montgomery was a proponent of the single thrust, or Schwerpunkt. He argued passionately for concentrating all available logistical support behind one powerful rapier-like blow. His plan was audacious, a narrow-front armored assault that would cross the Rhine in the north, outflank Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, and drive straight for Berlin. It was a high-risk, high-reward gamble that in Montgomery's view could end the war in a matter of weeks. In the first week of September, with Antwerp in his grasp, Montgomery saw his chance. The port, he argued, could supply his single thrust. The primary objective, therefore, should be the drive north into Holland, clearing the Scheldt estuary. The 60-mile-long waterway connecting Antwerp to the North Sea was a secondary concern that could be dealt with later. In a now infamous signal to Eisenhower, he insisted that the capture of the approaches to Antwerp was a task for which he simply did not have the resources, if he were to simultaneously prepare for his daring thrust into the Netherlands. Eisenhower, ever the coalition commander, sought a compromise. He would not halt the American armies under Patton and Bradley to give Montgomery all the supplies, but he would authorize Montgomery's ambitious plan. It would be called Operation Market Garden, a massive airborne assault to seize a carpet of bridges over the rivers of Holland, opening a corridor for British armor to cross the Rhine at Arnhem. On September 17th, the largest airborne operation in history was launched. The world watched, holding its breath, and in doing so, the Allied High Command took its eyes off the real prize. The critical war-winning objective was not a bridge at Arnhem, but the muddy, unassuming waterway of the Scheldt. In his own memoirs, Eisenhower would later call this decision the most serious mistake of the war. While the Allies looked north, the German command was working feverishly to salvage a catastrophe. Trapped in the coastal regions of the Pas-de-Calais was the entirety of the German 15th Army. Commanded by General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, this force of over 80,000 men and thousands of vehicles and artillery pieces was cut off. To their east, the British were racing into Belgium. To their north, the sea. Their only escape route was across the mouth of the Scheldt estuary, from the area around Breskens to the islands of South Beveland and Walcheren. What followed was a minor miracle of German improvisation, a Dunkirk in reverse. Under the nose of an Allied air force focused on Market Garden, von Zangen organized a flotilla of anything that could float: fishing trawlers, barges, small naval craft, even rowboats. For 3 weeks, this makeshift fleet shuttled men and equipment across the 3-mile-wide channel. By the time the Allies finally turned their attention to the area in late September, von Zangen had successfully evacuated nearly his entire army, complete with its heavy guns. These were not the broken remnants of the army that had fled from France. These were disciplined, battle-hardened troops who were now ordered to turn and fight, and they had found the perfect place to do it. The geography of the Scheldt estuary was a defender's paradise and an attacker's worst nightmare. The waterway was commanded by 3 main land features. To the south lay the Breskens pocket, a flat, waterlogged expanse of coastal land crisscrossed by canals and dikes. To the north of the estuary was the island-like South Beveland Peninsula, connected to the mainland by a narrow, easily defended isthmus. And guarding the very mouth of the sea was the formidable fortress of Walcheren Island. Heavily fortified as a key part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, Walcheren was studded with massive concrete gun emplacements, bunkers, and anti-aircraft batteries, its coastline bristling with long-range coastal artillery that could dominate the sea lanes for miles. The very land itself was an enemy. Much of the region consisted of polders, low-lying tracts of land reclaimed from the sea, protected by a network of dikes. The Germans, with grim expertise, began to systematically demolish these dikes, allowing the cold North Sea to flood the battlefield. Fields turned into vast shallow lakes of mud and salt water, impassable to tanks and vehicles. Roads became elevated causeways, perfect killing grounds for pre-sighted artillery and machine guns. Infantry would be forced to advance through chest-deep freezing water or along the exposed tops of the dikes with no cover whatsoever. This was the task that now fell to the 1st Canadian Army. Often called the Cinderella Army, this formation, commanded by Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, and in his absence, the brilliant and ruthless Lieutenant General Guy Simons, was one of the most multinational forces on the Western Front. Alongside its Canadian divisions were the British 1st Corps, the 1st Polish Armored Division, and contingents of Belgian, Dutch, and Czech troops. They had performed magnificently since Normandy, but were often assigned the grinding, unglamorous, and brutal attritional battles. Now they were handed the job that the High Command's strategic gamble had made necessary. The Battle of the Scheldt would be their ordeal. The campaign, as devised by Simons, was a complex, multi-phase operation. The first phase, codenamed Operation Switchback, was to clear the Breskens pocket south of the estuary. The task fell to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. On October 6th, the battle began. It was a scene from a Dantean inferno. The Canadians had to cross the Leopold Canal, a formidable anti-tank ditch, and push into the flooded polderland beyond. A veteran of the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment later recounted the crossing. The far bank was just a solid sheet of fire from Spondaus. The boats that made it across were few. We were pinned down in the mud trying to scrape a hole for cover as the mortars came in. You could hear them coming, that soft whump asterisk in the distance. And then you just prayed. The fighting was intimate and savage. Small groups of infantry, isolated in a landscape of water and mud, fought bunker to bunker, farmhouse to farmhouse. The Germans, from the veteran 64th Infantry Division, contested every foot of ground with a fanatical defense. Progress was measured in yards and came at a terrible price. The mud-fouled weapons drowned the wounded and exhausted the living. Mines were everywhere. The Germans had sown the landscape with thousands of them, particularly the dreaded shoe mine in its wooden box, undetectable by Allied minesweepers, and the S-mine, the infamous Bouncing Betty, that would spring into the air before detonating at waist height. Every step was a risk. To overcome the waterlogged terrain, Simons deployed a flotilla of amphibious tracked vehicles. The American-made LVT, or Buffalo, a lightly armored landing vehicle, proved indispensable. In a bold amphibious assault on October 9th, troops of the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade were loaded into Buffaloes, traveled from the port of Terneuzen and landed behind the German lines in the Breskens pocket, creating a second front. It was a tactically brilliant move, but the fighting remained a slow, agonizing grind. For nearly a month, the 3rd Canadian Division slogged its way through the pocket. When the town of Breskens finally fell, it was a ruin. By November 3rd, the south bank of the Scheldt was finally declared secure. Operation Switchback had cost the Canadians over 2,000 casualties. Simultaneously with the battle for the Breskens pocket, another phase of the operation, codenamed Vitality, had begun. The objective was to clear the South Beveland Peninsula, north of the estuary. The initial attack was entrusted to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. Their path was blocked by the South Beveland Isthmus, a narrow strip of land only a few hundred yards wide in places, dominated by a single main road and railway line. The attack began on October 24th. It was a linear frontal assault into a perfectly prepared German defensive zone. The Germans had dug in deep along the isthmus, creating a formidable bottleneck. The advance of the Canadian infantry was met with a storm of machine gun fire and mortar rounds. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Black Watch of Canada, the Calgary Highlanders, all were fed into the meat grinder. A first-hand account from a Black Watch officer described the causeway as the longest, loneliest road in the world. Men advanced by crawling over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Progress was non-existent. Seeing the futility of the frontal assault, Simons once again turned to amphibious tactics. On the night of October 26th, the British 52nd Lowland Division, a formation originally trained for mountain warfare but now repurposed for amphibious operations, crossed the Scheldt in landing craft and established a beachhead on the peninsula's southern coast, deep behind the German lines on the isthmus. Caught between the Canadians to the east and the British to the west, the German defenses on the peninsula finally began to crumble. By October 31st, South Beveland was in Allied hands. 2 parts of the puzzle were complete, but the final piece, the fortress of Walcheren Island, was the most formidable of all. Walcheren was the linchpin of the entire German defense. It was a heavily armed bastion, ringed by dozens of immense steel and concrete artillery casemates. The powerful guns of Battery W-17 near Domburg could hurl 1-ton shells over 25 miles, commanding the approaches to the Scheldt. The German garrison, under the command of Lieutenant General Wilhelm Dosser, was well supplied and determined. The direct assault was deemed suicidal. The plan to reduce this fortress was brutal and controversial. It came from the top. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, head of RAF Bomber Command. If the German defenses were too strong to be overcome from the outside, they would be drowned from within. The plan was to breach the massive sea dikes that protected the low-lying island from the North Sea and allow the ocean to inundate the German positions. The ethical implications were stark. Walcheren was home to 40,000 Dutch civilians. Leaflets were dropped, warning them in stark terms, go to the high ground, for your own safety, leave the island, or if you cannot leave, go to the towns of Middelburg or Vlissingen. The dikes are going to be bombed. On October 3rd, the raids began. Squadrons of RAF Lancasters, designed for area bombing cities, now targeted the ancient sea walls. At Westkapelle, the huge dike that had protected the island for centuries was shattered. A torrent of seawater, a churning, unstoppable wall of gray, began to pour onto the island. Further raids breached the dikes at Vlissingen and Vera. The landscape was transformed into a surreal aquatic battlefield. Only the dunes along the coast, the central spine of the island, and the built-up areas of the towns remained above water. German gun positions were isolated on newly formed islands, their communication lines cut, their ammunition stores flooded. The German defenders were now trapped in a cold, watery hell. But they did not surrender. They manned the still dry bunkers and pillboxes along the island's coastal perimeter, waiting for the inevitable assault. That assault, Operation Infatuate, came on November 1st. It was a 3-pronged attack of incredible daring and ferocity. The first prong was another brutal frontal assault, this time across the Walcheren Causeway. This mile-long, 40-yard-wide artificial land bridge was the only land link between South Beveland and Walcheren. It was utterly exposed, swept by machine guns and mortars from the island's defenders. The task fell to the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade. First, the Black Watch of Canada tried to storm the causeway. They were decimated. Then the Calgary Highlanders attacked, managing to secure a tenuous tiny bridgehead on the island itself, but were hit by a ferocious German counterattack and thrown back with grievous losses. Finally, a company of the Le Régiment de Maisonneuve managed to cling to a foothold. The causeway had become a charnel house, a monument to the futility of such attacks. The battle there would stalemate for days. The main assaults, however, came from the sea. At dawn on November 1st, a flotilla of Royal Marine Commandos, part of the 4th Special Service Brigade, approached the town of Flushing, or Vlissingen, on the southern coast, under the command of Brigadier B.W. Lester. Men of No. 4 Commando, which included French troops, stormed ashore into the port town. What followed was a vicious, disorienting battle of street fighting. They fought through flooded streets, clearing houses one by one, using assault boats to cross submerged town squares, all under constant sniper and machine gun fire from German strongpoints. The fighting was confused, chaotic, and deadly, lasting for days. Simultaneously, the most dramatic landing of all was taking place at West Capelle, on the island's westernmost point. Here, where the dike had been breached, the sea surged in and out with the tide through a massive gap. The plan was for numbers 41, 47, and 48 Royal Marine Commandos to land on either side of this gap and roll up the German defenses along the dunes. They were supported by a bizarre fleet of landing craft known as the Support Squadron Eastern Flank, a collection of 27 small gunboats, many armed with rockets and tank guns, commanded by Captain A.F. Pugsley. Their job was to sail in close and saturate the German coastal batteries with fire just before the commandos landed. What they found was a line of concrete monsters that had barely been scratched by the naval bombardment. The German gunners, with incredible courage, emerged from their bunkers and engaged the support squadron in a point-blank duel. The lightly armored landing craft stood no chance against the huge coastal guns. One by one they were hit, exploding in fire and smoke. Of the 27 vessels, 9 were sunk and 8 more crippled. Over 170 sailors were killed and 150 wounded. But their sacrifice was not in vain. For 90 critical minutes, they drew the fire of the German batteries, allowing the landing craft carrying the commandos to reach the shore. The commandos of 41 and 48 Commando landed on the shoulders of the gap, fighting their way up the sand dunes and into the German bunker complexes with grenades and bayonets. The scenes were medieval. Marines, drenched and freezing, stormed positions held by equally determined German soldiers. Meanwhile, No. 47 Commando's landing went awry. Their landing craft hit mines and obstacles, forcing them to wade ashore south of their objective, disorganized but fighting. From West Capelle, the commandos began their grim task, a 7-mile crawl north and south along the dune line, systematically destroying every German battery and strongpoint. It was a slow, brutal process, fought with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and close-quarter combat. By November 6, the commandos advancing from West Capelle linked up with the forces fighting in Flushing. The German garrison in the island's capital, Middelburg, now completely isolated by the flooding, was called upon to surrender. General Dosser, realizing his position was hopeless, capitulated on November 8. The last pockets of German resistance on Walcheren Island were silenced. The fortress had fallen, but the guns falling silent did not mean the Scheldt was open. The waterway was one of the most densely mined naval passages in the world. The Germans had sown it with thousands of mines of every description: acoustic mines triggered by the sound of a ship's engines, magnetic mines activated by a steel hull, and classic contact mines. The colossal task of clearing this deadly harvest fell to the Royal Navy. A fleet of over 100 minesweepers began the painstaking, nerve-wracking process of sweeping a clear channel to Antwerp. It was a battle just as real and just as dangerous as the one fought on land. Day after day, the little ships steamed back and forth, cutting mine cables and detonating the deadly spheres with rifle fire. Several ships were lost, adding to the butcher's bill. Finally, on November 28, 1944, 85 days after the port had been captured, the first Allied convoy sailed up the now safe waters of the Scheldt. At its head was the Canadian-built freighter, the SS Fort Cataraqui. As it steamed past the battered shores of Walcheren, the surviving Royal Marine Commandos, still clearing the last remnants of the island, stood and cheered. The logistical lifeline of the Allied armies was finally open. In the weeks and months that followed, Antwerp would prove its worth 1,000 times over. Millions of tons of supplies would pour across its docks, sustaining the final Allied advance into Germany and the defeat of the Third Reich. It fueled the armies that repelled the German offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, a battle which would have been infinitely more perilous without the supplies flowing through Antwerp. The cost of this victory was staggering. The Battle of the Scheldt resulted in 12,873 Allied casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Of those, nearly half, 6,367, were Canadian. It was a higher casualty rate than in the Normandy campaign. It was a bitter, grinding battle fought in the worst possible conditions. a battle necessitated by a strategic gamble that had failed to prioritize the one objective that truly mattered. Perhaps for this reason, the Battle of the Scheldt has been largely overshadowed in popular history, eclipsed by the drama of Market Garden and the shock of the Battle of the Bulge. There were no glorious cavalry charges or daring parachute drops. Only the grim, methodical, and profoundly courageous work of infantrymen and commandos wading through mud and water against a determined and skillful foe. It was a dirty, necessary, and heroic job, performed by the forgotten army of the war. Theirs was not a glamorous victory, but it was without question one of the most decisive. They had paid the price in blood and courage to open the artery that would keep the heart of the Allied war machine beating. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more stories.